you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 11, season 2. I love having farmers on here on this podcast who are in some of perhaps the regions or climates or soil types that we haven't really had a chance to explore yet. And Sugartop Farms kind of covers all of that. They're in Florida. They farm on basically beach sand. And they have a season that sort of runs over the wintertime when light levels are perhaps a little bit lower. Super interesting stuff. I'm so excited to have Jordan Cooper on here to kind of fill us in on what it's like to farm there. We explore a lot of the challenges they face, why no-till became somewhat of a necessity for them, and so much more. Really great stuff. Super excited to share it. Also, as we head into the winter and you start thinking about investing in your education at conferences and such, keep us in mind, especially for our West Coast folks. We will be out there in February in San Diego for another No-Till Growers Intensive. And this is designed by farmers for farmers to maximize the education, to get the most out of it, to have the most fun. And this intensive is going to be with Jared Smith of Jared's Real Food and Stephen Cornett of Nature's Always Right. You may know Stephen's work. He's got quite a popular YouTube channel, but you may not know Jared's work. If you are not familiar with this farm, make sure to check out the episode of the podcast we did with Jared last season in season 1. He's doing this sort of large-scale lasagna gardening, which I think, one, kind of blew my mind. He's doing a lot of really cool permaculture concepts, but he's doing it in a production model. And also, I just think for an arid climate, like this is a really awesome approach to retaining more moisture and for rapid soil building, and for getting into plots pretty fast. So it's going to be there. It's going to be at a new plot that he's setting up. So we're going to get to see that. He's going to give a talk. Steven's going to give a talk. I'm also going to contribute a little bit. And I just think there's so much value to be had in that style of farming, especially in that arid climate. So check that out. It's at the notillgrowers.com/events. And as always, there are discounts for Patreon members at patreon.com/farmerjesse. All right. Enough for me. Let's get to our amazing interview with Jordan Cooper of Sugartop Farms. Jordan Cooper, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jesse.
Absolutely. Super excited to have you on because we haven't really had anybody in your area on the podcast, but there's so many interesting things that could come out of a conversation with somebody in Florida because your climate is so unique. So first, maybe you could give the listeners and me a little bit of an overview of your farm, where you're located and kind of what kind of acreage you're working with there and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, sure. So we are in Florida. Like you said, we're based in Central Florida. And to give you a little bit of an idea of more specifically where we are 45 minutes approximately northwest of downtown Orlando, which is kind of the center of Orlando. And then we're about 45 minutes north of Disney World and that whole area. So we are kind of have some good markets around us. What makes us a little bit more unique in the specific location that we're in our little microclimate is we are technically the highest point in Florida, so or what you call the peninsular Florida. So there's a couple higher points in the Panhandle, but as far as the peninsula and south, we are 312 feet, which I know doesn't sound a lot to a lot of people in other states, but it is the highest point in this part of Florida. So it causes a little bit of a microclimate around here. We are on 2.5 acres in total. We do live on the farm, so there's a little bit of room, obviously, for home life and backyard and stuff like that. So we're growing approximately on about 3/4 of an acre of purely veg. We do have some fruit trees in production, so we have about 75 peach trees, some nectarines sprinkled in there. We have a few plums. We have probably 70 to 80 pineapples, some blueberries, some avocados. So some things that some are for us. Some, if we have extra, we can sell to a chef. Chefs always love fruit. So yeah, but we're in Central Florida, and we're both not from this area, but we moved here we've been on this land about 5 year, actually, yeah, it's going to be 5 years coming up next month, I believe. We're entering our fifth season of growing. So this our season starts from we start pulling crops out of the ground in September, the beginning of September, all the way through March. So we have June, July, and August normally put into cover crop in the field, and we do microgreens year round. So that's a big part of our business as well. We have 3 tunnels right now. One is mainly for propagation and microgreens and transplant starts. The other one is a little bit more for warm season type crops, and we mainly use that for tomatoes. And then we have what we call a salad house, which is a shade house. It's our tallest structure. It's open on all sides to get maximum airflow, and that one is our biggest at 24 by 154, and we plan to double that and build a new shade house or an additional shade house. I think we're going to go gutter connected and do the same size. So we should have one next to the other, and that should be coming up probably during the season in the next few months here. And yeah, that's pretty much the lay of the land over here.
Okay, so with this September to March season, are you not growing from April until October or through September? Are you not growing in that period because
So
it's
it's actually
too
to
hot?
May. I may have misspoke. So it's
Oh,
September.
sorry.
And it's okay, all the way through May. So we really have 3 months off. And yes, it gets way too hot. And it may seem like you could grow certain type of crops, but the only ones, definitely on a commercial scale, you can maybe do some things in a home garden maybe a little bit differently. But you can really only do certain crops in the summer, which don't really interest us, and we do want a little bit of downtime. But I mean, the only things you can get away with around here: okra, hot peppers, eggplant. Trying to think what else. It's really few and far between. Some things will grow, but you just really can't harvest too much. So like sweet potatoes will obviously grow, some ginger, turmeric, if it's in the shade a little bit. But it's more so our humidity is out of hand. Our temperatures are extremely hot for the duration of the day. So really from morning until night, there's really no reprieve. The humidity is still extremely high throughout the nighttime, and of course in the day. The insect pressure just goes through the roof. And for some things like tomatoes and stuff like that, you could be thinking, I've seen it in southern climates before, but really what it is the nighttime temperatures. We're around 75, 76 at night, and it's not even cool enough to set fruit on tomatoes. We've tried doing a little experiment in the spring to see how far tomatoes will go, and they kind of just start quitting around that June mark. It just gets a little too warm. Like I said, insects will kind of take over the humidity. Disease pressure kind of gets a little intense there. So for those 3 months, it's just better. And a lot of farms in Florida do take it off. There's the ones that try to push it, and you can. It's just limited crops, and I guess for whatever reason, maybe some people may do. But for us, it just makes sense to kind of, especially with our crops, our crop focus being a little bit more on salad greens and the delicate, more cooler season crops, it just makes sense. And to be honest with you, September, because we have to start that obviously late July, August, and then when it finishes in May, it's really difficult just to do those two kind of fringe parts of our season. Just because of the days get too long. It's just for all the reasons I mentioned before. It just gets a little too intense, and you're better off waiting and putting your fields into cover crop to hopefully rebuild the soil that we don't have much to begin with. So it's a good time to let the farmers get a break. It's a lot of times, or a lot of how I explain it to other people is the winter in northern farms. So there may be some things you can get away with and do some growing under structure, but for us, it's just not really worth it. We do the microgreens year round, and we do that under shade cloth as well, but it's a little bit more able to cool down the crop sometimes, either with misting, or it's a little bit more controlled as opposed to field crops, even though we do some in the big high tunnel shade cloth structure. It's just microgreens are a little bit easier to especially when you can choose the crops that you can grow with microgreens wise, and chefs a lot of times are flexible with that. So yeah, it just makes sense for us to do the September to May
Okay,
schedule.
so if you're only growing from September to May, but you're a little bit further south, is your light level dropping to the point that stuff is growing slower, even though the temperatures are more conducive to growing? Does that make sense? Like up here, we can't grow as quickly in the winter because the sunlight is so low.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely gets lower, but things still. I mean, it is the winter here is like the summer, I would say, in far northern places. Probably not quite where you are, but maybe in the. I mean, you can't grow your warm season crops as far as like in the field. We tried one year doing some squash and zucchini, and it's just painfully slow. I mean, it's just because of the light hours and probably have to do with the nighttime temperatures a little bit. But things do grow slowly, but it is perfect conditions for anything from lettuce to baby greens, things like that. In the wintertime, we're probably looking at on an average temperature from December until February, we're somewhere, it could be anywhere from the highs during the day might be 70, and the highs on the low side will be maybe 70. You'll get up to on the low end, and then it'll still get to 85 in the middle of the winter during the day. And the sun is still really strong here. It's I wish it wasn't, but it really the whole year there's really no reprieve from it, which is why we grow under shade a lot and why we don't take off shade even in the winter. So that may answer your question a little bit more. I thought we were going to be having to remove our shade cloth, and everything just grows better. So to answer your question, things do grow well. The warmer fruiting type crops, maybe not so much, and we don't waste our time with those. But as far as a lot of the root crops, salad crops, the main things we focus on, that is the premier time in order to grow it is our winter.
Can you tell us a little bit about marketing? Like how are you distributing that produce? What's your sort of are you doing CSA farmers market? What's that setup look like?
Yeah, so Florida's interesting in the fact that we don't have a ton of competition with other farms, probably because it's so difficult to grow here based on the soil and the weather, which we touched on. Um, we could talk on the soil a little bit later. But as far as competition wise, there's not a ton. So we're really able to pick and choose what works best for us. I know a lot of other people or farmers in areas kind of have to figure out the lay of the land and then kind of find their little niche. And we had to do that a little bit, but more so we were able to figure out what works best for us. We didn't really necessarily want to go the CSA route and have that that pressure on us to produce every week and have an array of certain crops and have to do with what people want and don't want. So we really from the beginning kind of not want to go down that CSA route. The restaurants really were something we looked at to begin with, and that was probably our first point of sales. But there's a lot of restaurants, especially in the Orlando in the Winter Park area, which is kind of a suburb of Orlando, but one of the more affluent ones. There's a lot of restaurants there that do want to buy locally that maybe didn't have the opportunity, or maybe we're getting stuff from farms 3-4 hours away. So we really saw a opportunity, speaking with chefs even before we started growing, to market to restaurants, and then we really wanted to do a farmers market. So it's kind of a long story with the farmers markets, but we really kind of pinpointed a couple farmers markets that we wanted to get into that were fairly close to our farm, maybe 15-20 minutes away. And we started off small with a couple smaller farmers markets, which looking back at it was great because it really gave us the opportunity to work out our kinks. Neither one of us, my wife Jessica or I, came from a farming background, so the farmers markets, it was our first time doing them. So we really started with some small ones, and for whatever reasons we couldn't get into some of the larger ones close by. And then we found one outside of Orlando in Winter Park, which is great because there's a lot of restaurants near there. Some chefs come to pick it up. So we do a Saturday morning market in Winter Park, and we've been doing that one for 3 years now. So that's been pretty consistent. We did do a little bit of grocery sales for a little bit. Wasn't really our cup of tea. It was a lot of packaging, a lot of plastic, a lot of you don't really see the customer, the farmer customer relationship with farmers with grocery stores. You're just kind of dropping it off in the back door. You're not even talking to a chef or anybody. It's just probably somebody in the back that's signing an invoice, and you're putting it in the walk-in cooler. So that wasn't really what we wanted to do too much of. But the restaurants really took off, and just probably in the past year and a half, we've been really exploring the Disney area, which is a huge market, as you can imagine. It's a little bit interesting. It's a little bureaucratic and red tape-ish as far as what you got to go through, but we've been selling to some restaurants and resorts outside of Disney, which is nice because you don't need to deal with the paperwork and the whole deal with Disney and everything they need to go through and in order for you to become a vendor. But we've been selling to some restaurants in Disney Springs, which is like what they call downtown Disney, which you don't need to actually go into the gates of Disney, which is nice because for deliveries it makes it a lot easier. But that's a huge opportunity for us, and we're probably nowhere close to fulfilling the potential out there. But really the only thing that we're selling to Disney or outside Disney restaurants are microgreens, just because of the volume they go through. So in order to sell them field crops, we would probably have to focus on one crop, and that probably wouldn't even be enough for their volume. So we've really focused on microgreens, both living trays and cut greens, and it's really worked out well because they go through a ton of volume, like I said, but microgreens are something they could appreciate the quality that we're selling them, as opposed to getting it through a wholesaler, the shelf life, the flavor, all those types of things. But it's not so burdensome in order to to deliver it a lot of times, and it makes for a pretty quick, easy delivery process. And yeah, that's been really nice for us. So there's a lot more potential out there that we could explore in that Disney area, but yeah, we probably sell to anywhere from 10 to maybe 14 restaurants a week.
So this downtown Disney area, is that where a lot of, I don't know, people that work at Disney live, or is that kind of...
No, actually, Disney Springs is more. It's kind of like if you wanted to go to Disney, but you didn't want to have to go in the theme parks, but you just wanted to go. There's no residential areas around in downtown Disney or Disney Springs, but it's a lot of restaurants, a lot of retail stores, so like high end clothing stores, almost like an outlet mall, if you will. Orlando has a lot of outlet malls, so it kind of goes to that when international crowds are coming to the States. A lot of times they shop here for clothes, I guess, because it's cheaper. So it's a lot of retail, a lot of restaurants. I mean, they have everything from like, attractions from Disney, not like rides per se, but like little kind of like they had a Star Wars thing. I know that when it came out, it was kind of like a little thing where you can kind of check it out, just like a sneak peek to maybe what they were doing in Disney. They have movie theaters, bowling. It's like anything you can imagine entertainment wise is in Disney. So instead of going to the parks and doing that whole thing, families may go there to have a night out at maybe a nicer restaurant or something. And it's a lot of like well-known chefs that obviously aren't working at that restaurant anymore, but I think there's like a Wolfgang Puck place, like Morimoto is one place to sell to down there, which he's kind of well known. So there's like all these spin-offs of well-known places that may be an international crowd, or even somebody from a different state would go, oh yeah, I recognize that name, and go eat at a restaurant like that. So it's more of like corporate type restaurants, which is also interesting because we're more dealing with the mom and pop type places that are individually owned. So it's a little bit different getting through the corporate and stuff like that with them. But once you get going, it's been pretty fruitful for us and pretty worth the while. So we've been pretty happy with that.
Yeah, that's great. Can you talk a little bit about well, maybe just kind of fill us in. You said that neither you nor your partner are from there. How did you all get down in Orlando and then start farming there, or in where you are and start farming there?
Yeah, so I should have said my wife Jessica, who works off the farm as well. She's been working off the farm at a different, a more corporate position since we graduated college. And we both went to school up here, and she is actually from a very rural town about an hour north of here. So we do have some familiarity, but Where we went to school at UCF is about an hour east of here, still Orlando, but it's east Orlando, and we're kind of on the west side of Orlando. So we had some familiarity, but I always heard of Claremont when I was in school and just thought of rural and, the boondocks and stuff like that. Even though Claremont has grown tremendously in the past 10 years, it's actually the largest city in our county now. But I grew up in South Florida. No ag experience, like I said. Came up to school up here. Jessica and I met, and then we moved back down to South Florida. We're actually in Fort Lauderdale. People might know that city. So on the southeast corner of Florida, where I'm from. And we lived there for a little while. We bought a house, got into gardening a little bit. It was kind of right at the downturn of the housing market. So we graduated college kind of at a bad time because there was no job market or anything like that. Both of us did find jobs, but we moved down there. We're fortunate enough to buy a home in a pretty good neighborhood, and we lived there for about 3 years. Made some renovations and changes, and we're able to sell it for a little bit of a profit once the market kind of rebounded. And then with that, we decided we wanted to get in a little bit more land. My wife's job was actually relocating around here about an hour northeast of where we live now. So we started buying property in an area you're not too familiar with, and when you don't live in that area, is pretty challenging. But we made it work. We were looking up here, and we were looking originally for 10, 20, 50 acres, something ridiculous looking back at it. And we wanted to grow have some sort of fruit production. So this is all citrus around here. I should have mentioned, so we're on old citrus, and back in the late 80s, I want to say, there was consecutive freezes. I think of 4 days where it killed all the citrus. I think it was in '89. So a lot of the citrus here got pushed over and became either housing developments or just sat barren or whatever it did. But in the past 5 years, I want to say, actually, I should say 10 years now, blueberry production in Florida skyrocketed. And it's for a couple of reasons. One, because of citrus dying off, and another just because we are in a climate where we are the first domestic producer that would produce a lot of fruit. So blueberries being one of the first fruits to produce in the springtime, University of Florida, our land-grant university, developed a lot of blueberries that were low chill. So you can get pretty much a premium for that first crop that you would be able to ship anywhere if you have certified organic blueberries. So that was the route we were looking for originally. Once I actually got with another organic fruit grower around here, which turns out to be my neighbor, which is pretty wild still when I think about it. But I reached out to him, and they had an organic fruit production business where mostly orange juice, but they worked with other growers, and they would help them with the distribution and marketing and all that type of stuff. So I actually reached out to him, and he took me on a tour in the area and showed me his different citrus groves, blueberry fields, all the different things, and then brought me by to his house, which was up here. And he goes, I'm growing some different experimental fruits, trying to figure out what will grow well here. He showed me some pomegranates, some blueberries, some dwarf citrus he was growing, and citrus here, and it was just kind of starting back then, but we have a disease, and pretty much the world has it now, but citrus greening. So the citrus industry is going down tremendously. So he was trying to find alternate crops to grow, which kind of had a light bulb go off in my head, which maybe I could get into this business and do something. And he was really big into pomegranates just because we're in kind of an arid climate in Florida. And with the elevation that I was talking about, it kind of is a well-draining, maybe kind of Mediterranean arid climate. So he was kind of experimenting. But long story short, he was bringing me all around the area. And this property here went for sale. And I was like, it's perfect property because it's flat. It's very unusual how it's in this place. But it was only 2.5 acres. And the funny thing, it's funny how things work out, but we decided on purchasing the property, and I'm not entirely sure what it was, but we came up here on a weekend, and I think the house was under contract, but the individual backed out of it for some reason. And it was just so happened we were up here this week and we went and saw it, and just something clicks when you see a property or a house and you're just like, this is meant for us. And it was interesting because we put did all the paperwork, everything, had the property was ours. We're waiting for it to close. And there was a local food summit that was going on in Orlando, and we were still living in South Florida. And I said, you know what, if I'm going to be getting involved in this local food scene, I should really try to make some connections, learn a little bit, and kind of see what the lay of the land is up here. And when this was about 5.5 years ago now or something, when I went to the conference, there was a few guests, but the main keynote speaker was John Martin, and it was just when his book was coming out. I didn't purchase the book, but I remember talking with him at the conference during one of the breaks, and him saying, this is a really good book. You should, for somebody your scale. And I remember thinking, being a little skeptical about it. There was no information about him or anything like that. I was real skeptical just hearing his story and how much he was grossing on the acre and a half. So that was really interesting. But once I went to that conference and listened to him, I'm sure as many people have, just things started clicking for me. Of course, purchased the book at the event, went home back to South Florida, read it, and knew right then and there exactly what we were doing. It was pretty much the blueprint of what we were doing was right there. We were on 2.5 acres. We had about an acre and a half to farm, and it was exactly what we wanted to do. And everything he was saying with the living standard and growing a family while you're farming as well, really catered to what we wanted to do. So everything kind of clicked with that. It was funny how it all kind of situated itself out. My wife works from home mostly, so the office an hour away wasn't such a big deal. But in Florida, it's very swampy, as most people might know. There's a lot. We live in Lake County. There's a lot of lakes even in this county, but we're in a very unique area. So this was just a very unusual piece of land. I liked that it was high and dry. The flat part was really nice, and it was just rare. And with other parts of Florida, you may deal with flooding concerns. All sorts of varmints and all sorts of things, that you may hear about Florida. But this really spoke to us, and it just worked out. And being here 5 years, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else in Florida. So everything just kind of worked out that way.
Yeah, that's super cool. I like hearing that story. And then also, well, let me just ask you this. You have this kind of small piece of land, and you're kind of following the market gardener style. What did that development look like? Like, what were some of the first things you did to get your 2.5 acres sort of ready for market gardening?
Yeah, so I want to the whole idea of, because no matter what you read about agriculture or vegetable farming, it's opposite in Florida. So that took me a little while to really understand. So anything you're reading, and then they say put it in April, that really means September and October here. So that took a little while to understand. So us moving here, it was right around, I want to say Halloween. So let's just say November. It was prime growing season. And there was just, in Florida, there's just a lot to be done in order to grow before you can. There's a lot to do to the soil or just groundwork before you can just grow it. If you put something in the ground, most if you don't have proper, everything set up, things are not going to last. We are pretty much in beach sand. Pretty much all of Florida is. I mean, you may get into the muckier areas. You may get into South Florida, has a little bit of a unique soil and structure, but in other places it's just sand. I mean, we started with less than 1% organic matter, I want to say, when we first got our soil tested. There is little to nothing going on in our soil, so it's not a very conducive area to grow vegetables. So to answer your question, though, the first thing that we did, there was one citrus tree remaining, and there was a giant, and I mean giant, lantana bush that was surrounding it, which is a pretty obnoxious and horrific smelling, in my opinion, weed, especially when you move it or touch it or anything. So the first thing that we did was remove that. But besides that, there wasn't too much to remove. It was pretty barren. The previous owners just mowed that piece of property for, since it became grass after citrus. So there really wasn't too much to be done in that regard. But as typical overzealous farmer that wanted to get going, I, of course, went to the local hardware store, rented a rototiller, and loaded it in my truck with 2x4s, got it out. I think my wife was away for the weekend, and I just started tilling. And to give you an example of, and of course it was a normal tiller, it wasn't to the intensity or level of a BCS tiller, but it wouldn't even, and we have rhizomal grass, but it wouldn't even cut through it. And it actually was really dangerous because the rototiller wouldn't even cut in. So it would kind of do these kind of skips along the surface of the grass. And once you would get it into the subsoil and it'd be doing its thing, I literally, and I'm about 200 pounds, I literally had to put my body weight as hard as I could on top of the tiller just for it to stay underground. So we're dealing with pretty serious roots in that sod. So long story short, we didn't do too much as far as the tilling didn't really go according to plan because the rhizomes just grew back and we just had like kind of a patchy looking sod thing going on for a little bit. But really having, I think the first groundbreaking or anything we did was my neighbor had and he was kind of starting a poultry farm at the same time we were. Good, it wasn't a vegetable farm, or there could have been some conflicting or competition there. But he came over and he actually rototilled with his, he has like a compact tractor, just to break ground. And we did probably a 1/4 acre to begin with. And then we started doing some soil improvements, mostly some compost, but looking back at it, probably wasn't the smartest move with that. But when you're dealing with such little organic matter, that's normally your first choice to go to build it up. So yeah, really to start with, we really just started with compost, trying to amend our soil, and a lot of learning those first couple seasons. But that was the start of it. We didn't get our first tunnel, I want to say, until year 2 or 3. I want to say it was a pretty big investment. But yeah, that was the start of it. And then fruit trees came a little bit later because I really wanted to get a head start on that, and that really just required. We got a BCS by then, and that was just tilling with the BCS, and we use some landscape fabric. I really found that useful. I forgot, I may have seen it somewhere, but just kind of wrapping our fruit trees with landscape fabric so the rhizomal grass wouldn't creep back, because it's, obviously creeps along and will come back, surround a tree pretty quickly if you don't do anything to that. So once we tilled and did some amending, we covered it with landscape fabric, and that's been pretty good for us. But besides that, that was pretty much it, until we kind of started getting a little bit of a better approach to soil building and soil health.
Hey, you all, just jumping in here real quick to get a word from today's show sponsor, Farmers Web.
Farmers Web software makes it easier for your farm to manage working with your buyers. By lessening the administrative load and increasing efficiency, Farmers Web helps you save time, reduce errors, and work with more buyers overall. Our free account includes features to manage your real-time and coming soon product availability, and tools to create your own availability calendar to inform buyers on the seasonality of your products. The free account also includes access to the Farmers Web Guide to Working with Wholesale Buyers, which offers pro tips and best practices on how to work with restaurants, schools, and other similar buyers. A 1-month free trial is available of the paid account, which includes features to manage your customers and orders, give select buyers special pricing and payment terms, track your buyers' payments, send invoices, keep detailed sales records, and much more. You can even manage orders for buyers who don't place them online. Access a demo video and learn more at farmersweb.com.
Big thanks to Farmers Web. Back to the show. You got the BCS, and then you started to kind of follow that general, like JM Fortier's sort of 30-inch bed system, or was that kind of what you went with?
Yep, we did 30-inch. I mean, we followed him just because this, and most people farming around that time. I mean, it seems like a while ago, but I guess it really wasn't. But a lot of information has come out since then. But yeah, that was our blueprint. We followed everything from the raised bed approach to the 30-inch beds. I mean, pretty much everything he said in that book and what he spoke about in the conference I went to, we followed. Exactly. So yeah, we actually didn't even start with the tiller. We first got the rotary plow as far as our first attachment, and I want to say the mower, which is primarily what we use now for the BCS. But we actually just tried plowing our beds instead of tilling them. And what we found was that when we went through the walkways and flipped our sand, but really soil over, was it just buried the sod. So any living sod that we had would just get buried, and being the stubborn grass that it is, it would just come back, and now you had sand or soil covering sod that now needed to be dug up a little bit more. So that was super frustrating, and something we figured out probably wasn't the best approach to begin with. Really thinking back to it, and I think a couple of your guests have kind of alluded to it, but if you're going to till once, I would say till 10 times if you're going to do it that initial plunge. And then when you're dealing with rhizomal grass, I mean, and this is before silage tarps got popular or anything like that, so that's something I would probably lean to now, and we still do. But really, just I wish I had my neighbor till it, until he told me he couldn't do it anymore, just because that grass is going to keep coming back, and if you have a rain event or anything after, it's really just going to grow that grass right back into your field. So we did the 30-inch bed. We did the rotary plow first. Once we realized that wasn't working too well, we really went to a little bit more of hand tools. I remember digging and raking a lot of raised beds at a certain point, which is crazy. And I remember my wife telling me, "You're nuts because you're doing it for hours." But I just remember saying, "No, JM says it's permanent. This is going to be a one-time thing." And looking back, it's pretty funny to think about it. Just because permanent beds, I mean, we still do have permanent beds, but we don't do raised beds. It's pretty silly to think about it now that we were doing raised beds back then for a variety of reasons. But raised beds and sand don't work, because if you're flipping a bed or if you're walking by a bed, if there's heavy wind, if you're talking about the sand that we inherited, that most of Florida has to begin with of their native soil, it's just going to start caving over. So we actually almost went to this kind of bed shape it's kind of hard to explain, but the outsides were a little bit taller, and then it would kind of cave into the middle. I thought that was very intuitive on my end, that I kind of thought about it, but talk about a lot of work and trying to get this kind of almost looks like a shower floor where it's draining kind of in the middle where your drain would be. But that clearly didn't work, because anything formed with clay, it's like imagine going to the beach and building a sandcastle and maybe not being moist all the time. You walk by it, you touch it, it's going to collapse. So that was pretty silly to think about, but we did do a lot of hand tools in order to build our first beds. And then we did get we got the tiller for the BCS, and then we started using that probably in year 2 or 3, probably year 2, I want to say, because we've been no-till for a little bit. But then that was kind of a, kind of a big deal with the tiller, just because we were trying so hard to build these beds, and there you could just run over the tiller and bam, you have 30 inches and it's like a pillow. And on our sand, literally you would step on it and go down about 6 to 8 inches. So it would really fluff it up a lot. But that kind of also turned a light bulb on my head that tilling maybe wasn't the best thing for our soil with the sand and everything involved. That it just things I started noticing, and we can get into that a little bit more. The tiller, because as soon as you till, as most people know, it's gorgeous. It looks like black dirt. That's what I've been waiting for. It almost seemed like this was the tool that we've been missing, but really, as most people know, you're bringing up your subsoil, and you're bringing up to the surface and that whole thing. So for a couple of days it looked great, but as I said, that was kind of one of the reasons that I started realizing maybe tilling wasn't necessarily for us. So that was we got the tiller and we used that for bed prep a little bit, and we used the Johnny's rake a lot for bed prep, and those were our two main things for the first couple seasons.
Cool. And then how did you sort of go away from the tiller? Like you were talking about, a little bit about soil health. Do you want to kind of talk a little bit about that transition from when you were using the tiller and the 30-inch beds and nothing was kind of sticking and you had all those issues with the sand, and then what you did to sort of remedy that?
Yeah, so I think what I noticed with the tiller, like I said, was you're bringing your subsoil up and it looks great, but then after a day or two, I was like, man, that kind of looks worse than the bed next to it, which I haven't tilled yet or haven't tilled in a while. So again, the light bulb kind of went off, and I put in the back of my brain and said, all right, it looks great. I have a lot going on right now, and this is almost a shortcut to bed prep. We'll just let it go for a little bit. But once I started noticing I guess the biggest thing was our organic matter from a visibility standpoint. So it's very easy. And the tiller was, I guess, important because if you put on, and we were putting on a lot of compost in those days, we would put on, as much as 6, maybe even, yeah, we'll say 6 inches. I mean, we wanted to put as much compost as possible because compost and sand, you would think if you mix it up, you got this kind of nice sandy loam consistency. And it seems right. And I think for, again, initial breaking ground and doing soil work, it's fine. But as far as repetitive bed flipping and what we're doing as far as salad greens and things like that goes, as anybody knows, you're flipping a bed, even in our 9-month season, it could be 5-10 times a year. I mean, obviously radishes, baby greens, things, are quick bed flippers. So when you're doing it so often, I was just it didn't make me feel good. And of course, with the microorganisms and everything, not that we have a lot or I ever seen an earthworm in our native soil or anything like that, but you just knew it wasn't great. So after seeing a tilled bed for a couple days, it just didn't look good, and it didn't look like our organic matter that we worked so hard to build was really sticking around, which makes sense with our high temperatures and the brutal sun day in and day out. It really cooks up your organic matter. So even if you're adding tons and tons of compost every year, eventually it's going to get burned out. I would think in most places, but a little bit quicker in Florida because of the temperature, because of the sand, all those factors involved. So the organic matter was the first reason that I think I didn't like the tiller so much, not to mention bringing the BCS into the field. It's not the most agile piece of equipment. It's certainly not the worst one to work with, but having my wife do some soil work, she wasn't too comfortable with it. It takes a lot. We have, I think, one of the bigger downfalls of the BCS as far as our fields go, and it may seem minor, but when you're turning it around a lot, it gets a little old. But we have, and I think a lot of people may do the same, but we have landscape fabric outlining our beds, just again mostly because of the rhizomal grass getting into our fields. It kind of gives us a little bit of a buffer in order to clean it out, and we like just the uniformity and the organization look that it kind of gives, that you're not just getting sand right up to your beds, and it kind of outlays it. But at the end, whether you're using the tiller, the rotary plow, and those are the two main ones we've worked with, but you have to lift that thing up pretty high in order to clear it from the landscape fabric without it getting quick. And it just, yeah, I'm pretty tall. It would still just kind of get a little annoying, and doing that over and over again, and turning it around and lifting it up and turning it around and lifting it up, it wasn't the best for what we wanted to do, not to mention the amount of time that it took. So once we started, probably 3 years ago, we started using the tilther, I want to say, and that really opened our eyes to, hey, this is a little bit better for organic matter. It isn't being so disruptive to the soil. It's super quick and easy. I can carry it around wherever I want in the field. Granted, it may use your battery pretty quick, but if you're not a large-scale grower, you shouldn't really have too much of a problem if you're just using it to flip beds. So that was once I started using that, and my wife would use it sometimes and she would like it. But we also started using a tool which is imperative for our no-till approach, which is the TerraTech wheel weeder, I think it's called. And it's pretty much a wheel hoe, but it's got kind of this. It's a really well-made tool, but it's got this kind of, how can I explain it? It's almost like it's like a soil stimulator. It kind of has these angled. It's not sharp blades, but it just has these angled blades on it that disrupts the soil enough to kind of maybe kill the red stage weeds, and then you kind of have that wheel hoe blade in the back, and it's 11 inches wide, so it's three passes on our bed with 1 inch overpass or overlap, and it really did a good job, not only for cropping out for, I mean, we use it for everything, cropping out, sowing our cover crop seed, uh, mixing amendments into the soil, so anything like that. And it really does a good job. It really does a similar job as the tilther. So once we started with those two tools, that was when I was like, why do we really need the BCS for bed flips, or really for most soil work? We got away from raised beds for a variety of reasons as well. So with all those things, it was just kind of like a gradual process to get out of the tilling. And we didn't till for long. The first season we didn't have a BCS. I want to say we used the tiller for one season, and then we would use it for things like incorporating our cover crop, which didn't work that great as well, because the cover crops, maybe it was the varieties we were growing, just would get bound up in the tiller if you were trying to put it back into the ground. And yeah, you could wait a little bit longer to till in your cover crop, but then you get into the whole argument of carbon versus nitrogen and that whole thing. So really, we've taken a different approach with our cover cropping, with our bed flipping, with our bed prep, and honestly, on our bodies, on time efficiency, it's really worked out for the better. So really, the only thing we're using our BCS for is mowing our cover crop, because we have the combo mower, mowing our grass, which is a lot of walking, but we do it that way, and we try not to do it often. But yeah, those are really only the two things. If we need to do like a drainage ditch or something, maybe we'll do the rotary plow. Yeah, so besides that, but it was just a gradual process, and I think I answered your question. But yeah, that was kind of the reason we got it out of the field.
Nice. That's interesting. So I'm assuming with the raised beds that you stopped raising them because one, you're on sand, so you don't really have to worry about them drying out. They're going to dry out pretty quickly either way. And then also, you don't want them to get hotter than your native soil, like you would maybe in Quebec or up north. Um, were there other reasons too? I mean, you said it kind of collapsed. Was that just becoming an issue where if you touch the sand, it basically just kind of falls down back into the paths anyway?
Yeah, I mean, even if you cultivated the bed and ran like a collinear hoe through it, it would just start collapsing. And um, I shouldn't say that I care so much about the looks of things, but it gets to the point where you're just like, I spent so much time building this bed, and it's just kind of starting to collapse. And forget a bed flip, it would just instantly just kind of, you would need to build up pretty much taking a rake and build up the from the walkways back into the bed, and it just kind of felt silly after a while. I think initially we did it too because when I had my neighbor with a tractor, we would just dump the compost, and it was kind of a good way with the rotary plow to flip it up, so any compost, which was valuable at that point, on our walkways, we could just flip it up into the bed, so we weren't composting our walkways, which felt like a waste. So for that reason, I think we did it. But the reasons we went away from it, and the biggest thing that stuck out to me, was I think I was listening to a podcast. I think it was Farmer podcast a while ago, and I want to say it was the Slinging Frogs Farm, and they spoke about going to, I think it was somewhere in Africa. I want to say Ethiopia, but I could be wrong. And they were talking about farming over there, and they had such little rain in wherever they were, in such arid conditions, and I believe it was sand as well, that they were actually using inverted beds, like dug out beds, which really, when I heard that, I was thinking, well, that's a little extreme. But then I thought about it, and I said, we live in a subtropical climate. Don't get me wrong, but we really don't get a ton of rain. And since we are 300 plus feet above sea level, drainage is it's kind of our best friend, but at the same time, it's our worst enemy because we can't, again, because of the organic matter, we can't keep moisture on our beds too easily. So temperature wasn't really too big of a factor because it's just hot. I don't know how big of a difference. It's not like we're, like you said too, we're not itching to get into our beds in the springtime because of it needs to thaw out or anything like that. So temperature wise, it wasn't the biggest thing. But when I heard that about the inverted beds, I said, well, why am I doing raised beds when we're trying to collect as much moisture as possible? The inverted beds make much more sense to me because any moisture that may get on the walkway or anywhere else is going to be then slowly almost acting as the bed is acting as a drain almost. So our drainage, just to give you an example, we had, since we've lived here, we've obviously had bad rain events. We had Hurricane Irma come through like right through here, and we don't even have a puddle afterwards. It's really crazy. We're at the peak of this mountain, so a lot of it goes down the slopes and things like that. But with the sand, it's, people make jokes, but it's back in the aquifer in like a minute after you water something. So that was the main reason, was the moisture. But it just from the upkeep, and it's just so much easier now. I don't need to worry about building anything up, knocking anything down, walkway, anything like that. With the cover crop, it's so much easier. So yeah, a ton of reasons, and very glad we did it. But it was that somebody talking about farming in Africa, believe it or not, that really made the light bulb go off and said, why are we doing this? So sometimes you need that, but it's been good since, just growing on flatbeds.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great story, and that's super interesting just to hear kind of these details. Like when I think about somebody growing in sandy soil, I don't think about the extreme of sandy soil, which is essentially you're growing in on a beach. So yeah, just all the challenges. I've never considered that, the drainage and those sorts of things. So with irrigation, how are you managing your irrigation? Is it well, one, where's the water coming from, and then second, like how are you watering all the time? Like what does that look like?
Yeah, so and just to go back to the sandy soil, there's some aspects of it where it's kind of like a blank canvas with the sand, because you're really starting from nothing, which is kind of nice. But I look at a lot of other farmers on Instagram or when they break ground and show pictures, and I'm drooling over what their native soil looks like. Even when we travel, we went to the Northeast this summer, and we normally go to like the Carolinas and stuff during the summer for our vacation. And I just like to get out, and the first thing I kind of check is, now that I'm farming, I never realized it before, but I'll just go over to a random, park or something, just scratch the soil surface, and I'm just like, man, this would be so nice to grow in. But so there's the aspect of it's a blank canvas, but yeah, it is very difficult. And there's other aspects, like we have some detrimental nematodes in our soil that just kind of live there, based on some, because of the citrus and other things. Root knot nematode is a big one that a lot of people, when you talk to growing anything in Florida, that they kind of have to deal with. And all of our peach trees and fruit trees are on their grafts, and their rootstock is on root knot nematode resistant rootstock. So there's some pluses and minuses, mostly minuses, but I just wanted to get that out there, that it's kind of exciting. If you have a blank canvas, you can kind of do whatever you want as far as building that organic matter and the nutrients in the soil. As far as irrigation goes, we were using a lot of drip irrigation, and I think it was JM that at one point, I think it was maybe when we saw him, calls it drip irritation, which I kind of agree with at this point, just because we live in a pretty windy area, being at the top of the mountain, and being in such sandy conditions. And I know a lot of people may not consider this, but if you think about it, when drip comes, and where we do use drip now, like in the tomato house, it's going to sound a little crazy, but we use 2-inch spacing drip. And that goes to show you, we initially were using the standard, I guess, standard for most people are maybe 6 or 12. So we were using that, and you would just get you would get obviously moisture where the emitter is, but you would go 2 inches either direction, and it would be quicksand. I mean, there would be no moisture whatsoever, and the plants weren't happy. And I remember listening to another podcast that I'm going back to, and I believe it was Farmer to Farmer 2. It was a guy in California farming, and he kind of talked about overhead versus drip, and just kind of how overhead is so imperative in the beginning stages of the plant because it wants to stretch out its roots, and all the root fibers and everything wants to just uptake as much nutrients and moisture as possible. And when you have drip, you're really just getting that one spot. And if you think about it, with sandy soil, it doesn't have a lot of lateral movement. It just goes straight down. So where if you're farming in heavy clay, you may get that initial drip and it may travel, I don't know, maybe like a 2-4 inch diameter, and you're covering that root zone. And wherever that root wants to go and wherever it finds nutrients, it's not going to have a problem reaching its nutrients because there's not enough moisture there. So after the first couple of years of using standard drip, we realized it wasn't the best thing for us. Also because it was moving around a lot in the wind, and we weren't using any plastics, which a lot of people do use plastics in Florida and then just put the drip tape underneath it, and that kind of keeps all the moisture in that bed in order for you to get that kind of full moisture level. Of course, we're not using disposable plastics, but we have moved to strictly overhead. We will change out to drip tape for certain crops, so we kind of have these drip manifolds that will slide off the poly for the overhead, and then we'll slide on these manifolds, which we can move around, and it's mostly like 4 beds at a time, and then that will have 2 to 3 drip lines per bed. And yeah, we can just move that. Once we get into the winter, we really don't use drip because it's mostly for your cucurbits, tomatoes. I mean, we could use it on others, but just moving it around, and since we already have permanent overhead irrigation in place, it just makes sense. The other reason overhead is, I mean, critical to us, I couldn't imagine, I really don't understand anybody that is growing in warmer climates that doesn't use overhead to germinate greens, but it just, with the sun being so strong and like I mentioned before, with the water not going laterally, we just dry out extremely quick. So yeah, in our context, we want to be running overhead, especially for our main crops as far as like salad greens, whether it's lettuce heads, baby greens, and then anything from crops, radishes, turnips, of course, carrots and stuff like that, especially during germination. But it is to run irrigation roughly 45 minutes an hour, multiple times during a day. Of course, it's easier said than done because based on delivery schedules or whatever, it's all manual valves. So it's just ball valves that we're going around and turning based on how long systems or how long blocks have run. And we have blocks kind of marked off in 4, or I want to say most of they're all 4. I think one place we have to go 3 just because of the way the beds were, but it covers. We use Seninger mini wobblers, and it's nice. Seninger is based in Claremont, so the manufacturer is actually right here. But it covers about 2 beds in either direction. So that's kind of nice. We get pretty good coverage. Germination works out well, but I just couldn't imagine, one, because of the overhead cools your crops off in short durations. 2, the sand, the lateral movement with the drip. So it's a no-brainer for us. Again, it was one of those things we learned the hard way, drip, and then moving to overhead. We were using like these little maxi jets and moving them in the first couple of years, which is kind of comical now, but no, we just in place have our mini wobblers and we could just crank them on. We are looking at going to an automatic system. So we actually just had a rep from Seninger, who's actually bought out by a different company, but we're talking about putting solenoids on each block. And I have an irrigation friend of mine that I've met since I moved up here. He's become a good friend of mine, and he would do the installation because it's I wouldn't say it's involved, but it's not something a farmer wants to do during season, but pretty much running a low voltage line to each one of those, and then I could go on my phone if I'm doing deliveries somewhere or something like that, I can just go and say, this is run for X amount of time, ran for X amount of gallons per minute. And I could just go on my phone no matter where I am, and it's all connected. And I could just say, switch on that, switch off that. And, and with the gallons per minute, you can see if a block has, or a line is busted or anything like that. It's pretty nice, especially for market days when you're, both me and my wife are at the market. She comes with me every other week. If nobody's here to turn on irrigation, it does get pretty dry, and it's kind of a rush to get back to turn that on. So that would be really nice, and it's something we're looking forward to in the future.
That is super cool. Yeah, this is something that my wife and I run into a lot, is being gone from the farm and needing to use some of that overhead. Because, like you said, we couldn't do it on drip alone. We barely use drip because it doesn't have the effect that we need in the summertime. Like, we don't generally lack for water, we lack for cooling qualities, so we need that overhead to just cool plants down a lot of times. But yeah, a lot of times when we're at the market, there's nobody here to do it, so my wife either has to leave early, which is often in the middle of the rush, or yeah, we have to pay somebody to be at the farm and watch the irrigation. So that's nice to hear, that you've invested in that. I feel like that's going to be a good investment. All right, just jump in here one last time to say that we have been seeing some amazing results on the Patreon page these last few months, and it is enabling us to do more video and audio work to contribute over there. So a lot of bonus material, and just more with the podcast in general. I really want to thank you all for your support. If you appreciate our work and want to kick us a couple bucks every month, get access to those videos, like the 10 Mothers Farm videos we did, the ones with J.M. Fortier and others. You get discounts there. So just go check that out at patreon.com/farmerjesse and sign up. Or you can always kick us a few bucks to @NoTillGrowers on Venmo, just to say thanks. That's always cool. We appreciate that very much. Patreon, however, comes with some perks. We appreciate your dedication to having a little bit of a monthly contribution. So it comes with some perks, and at certain levels, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to J.M. Fortier, Tiffany Jackson, Dawson Mahalko, Weaver Akers, Benson Morris, Isaac Bules, Jeff Hayes, Atlas Hardage, Andrea Barnhart, William White, Rachel Klein, Jared Lukens of Black Budding Moon Farm, Yannick LaPlante, Ryan Gosser, Andy Birdsley, Fox Hill Farm, our homie Jay Armour, Handsewn Homegrown, Damon Finney, Jeffrey Windhurst, Brittany Heller, Maurice Strickland, Andrew Hammerstein, Seeds of Solitude, Glenn Bell, Grant Timms, Kristen Clement, L. Dean Mullis, Evan Morgan, and Jim Appleberry. Thank you all so much. Back to Jordan. I want to talk a little bit about your bed prep and stuff. In terms of, like, and I know we talked about it, but there's been a couple things that I was kind of curious about, like cover crops. So you said you were sowing these cover crops mostly through the summer, and then how are you terminating those cover crops, and then what does that process sort of look like?
Yeah, that's something I've put a lot of thought into over the years, and still do when I just sit and look at the cover crop and think about what's the best way for our soil. And being no-till and talking with other growers around here that do grow a lot of the same varieties as us. So it's, I wouldn't say we've figured it out. I think this past season, it was a little bit of an unique cover crop year for us based on a couple factors, but I thought our termination method and kind of our bed prep, from which we pretty much, actually I literally just finished the last block of our cover crop going into season, so that'll get planted probably this week, and then we'll be pretty much almost at capacity. But yeah, we specifically grow sun hemp in the summer, so that in Florida, at least for Florida organic growers, is probably the top cover crop that we grow here. We initially did some iron clay cowpea. It just gets a little too viney for us. It doesn't have the biomass that we're looking for. It does have some nematode suppression, but not nearly the amount that sun hemp does. So sun hemp is a very, very vigorous grower. It's supposed to be drought tolerant. It's supposed to be heat tolerant. I would beg to differ based on after seeing it in dry summer conditions. If I didn't have that overhead irrigation, it probably would not have made it. But once it gets to a certain point, it can handle the Florida summers pretty well, and it grows extremely quick. I mean, it could grow a foot a week, if not more. So if we get rain, especially, it'll just go bananas. So but once we get it, and we had some this year that probably got to, I want to say maybe 10, 12 feet tall. I mean, it'll get tall in a hurry. So we got it in at we crop out our last beds and don't really like to leave our soil barren. So we'll just um, start putting in our cover crop. And the way we incorporate it, like I mentioned before, we've used the tilter. We've actually used the BCS tiller before, but I think it buries it a little bit too far. I heard that as a recommendation from another farm. But the tilter works well. But if you're trying to get in a decent amount of cover crop, unless you got batteries on deck, you're not going to get too far. So that wheel weeder that I was referring to does a really nice job of incorporating the cover crop seed. Once it's up and going, our method of chopping it was, so I have a combo mower on my BCS, which if it's a reasonable height, it works pretty well. It may get bound up a couple times, and you may need to just kind of lift up and go over a certain part. But I do have neighbors with tractors, so if it gets really out of hand, like that really, really large fibrous area that was first to be planted, I had my neighbor come and he just bush hogged it. Once it's on the ground, we've tried in the past to get a couple cuts out of it in the past too, because I know, speaking with a friend of ours that has a farm about an hour away, they can get a second crop, except for, I guess, their bush hog can get a little bit higher. If you're not leaving that bottom leaf on there, it's obviously not going to grow back. So it depends on a couple different factors. If it's kind of dry and the sun hemp starts losing some of its leaves on the bottom, it's obviously going to not work. But you can try for a couple cuts, which we haven't been too successful with, but it kind of keeps the sun hemp at a little bit more, I mean, it can get super fibrous. So almost picture like, I hate to say like bamboo or something, but almost like kind of lemongrass-ish. It just gets extremely, it's a lagoon, but it'll get really, really large diameter, and take longer to break down. So if you can kind of get a second cut, it helps with that, and can already start breaking down that first initial cut while you're still getting growth on that remaining cover crop. But then once it's cut, really this past season, what we did, and I should say it was a little bit of an unusual cover crop season, because we had a pest on our cover crop, which was then getting into one of our houses where we grow the microgreens, and we were seeing some damage on the microgreens. So I had to make a decision to, even though wasn't too early, we had to terminate probably 2 or 3 weeks before we'd like to. So I was kind of sitting with this debris a little bit longer. But what our method and what I like the best that we did this past season, or this past summer, only a few months ago, was we use silage tarp. So once it's cut, I may let it go I think we did some immediately, but then what happens is it's so fibrous, and I'll then go with the BCS and try to cut it at the ground level, because what you'll end up is with these little almost sun hemp spikes where it came off, and they're so fibrous that you still have this kind of, and if you walk on it, it'll almost, I mean, it can go through your shoe. They're strong and they're kind of sharp, so it'll cause holes in the silage tarp, which you don't want for oculation. So I'll kind of go through and try to mow it as low as possible before I do use that. We try to get some moisture on there, and then we'll cover it with the silage tarp. And we did some with the silage tarp and some without it, and it was really amazing, even with the biomass on top from the sun hemp, which is a good amount of biomass, which is the main reason people do grow sun hemp. It broke down, but when I took the silage tarp off, it broke down more. It was more tender. It was obviously no weed pressure whatsoever. But what I noticed interesting too is weeks after the silage tarp was lifted and we'd rake away the sun hemp, which is our method, instead of incorporating it, which really the only way to do would be disc or tilling, and at that point it's browned and you're probably looking at more carbon than nitrogen. But we rake it to the walkways mostly, or since we have permanent overhead irrigation, what I mostly like to do is rake it into those permanent irrigation lines, which helps out on weeding and efficiency, because you're not really getting paid to do weeding in your irrigation line. So that is a big help, and it's nice to just have a little bit of organic matter breaking down just for the microbiology in your walkways, or even if it's not in the walkway and it's in the irrigation line, it's nice just to have a little bit. I'm a little concerned about potentially harboring some pests this time of year, so that's something I'm trying to keep an eye out a little bit. But yeah, that's pretty much our method, is to kind of rake it back and not incorporate any of the cover crop, and just kind of let it do its thing for about 4 to 6 weeks on top of the surface. If it's silaged, we could get away with about 4 weeks pulling that off, and then either moving the tarp somewhere else or letting that break down a little bit after once we pull it off. But it's really amazing to see the difference in the silage tarp with the weed pressure. Now that we're in season, looking at what I have silage tarped and what I haven't, and weed seeds aren't popping up through the sun hemp once it's cut, but when you pull it away and start growing a cash crop in there and irrigating it regularly and doing that whole thing, you start noticing a good amount popping up in certain areas that maybe during the summer got blown in or whatever. But the silage tarps are pretty amazing, and it's something we're going to look at again with the wind up here. It's a little bit of a pain with the summer storms, because we'll have a summer rain episode, which is every day pretty much during the summer, during could be for a couple weeks at a time, and then you might not get anything, but it'll be borderline like hurricane for an hour and then just completely be okay. I mean, that's just Florida. But with the high temperatures and different pressures coming off the ocean, it causes for afternoon storms a lot of the time. So yeah, I think that answers your question, but that's kind of what we went to this year. I think we'll keep going that way unless something happens or that we're looking at. But almost going with the BCS too, I should mention, it's almost crimping it because of the weight of the BCS mower is almost going through and it's crimping that, so it's killing it off at that point, and then the mower is more chopping it into little pieces. And I should mention too, I borrowed a flail mower from another grower that we became friends with and was super excited about trying that, but then didn't realize, and still don't know this factually, but it kept on getting bogged down in our soil. So I have to think, I got my BCS 5 years ago or somewhere around then. I have standard tires, so I think you need the taller tires in order to operate the flail mower. So I was unable to use the flail mower this year. Next year, I may borrow their entire tractor, which they nicely volunteered, because I just want to see how the flail mower would work as opposed to the combo mower.
I'm so happy that we've spent so much time on soil here, because I kind of want to talk just about one more thing, is that you're using the paper pot. How has that gone in terms of keeping, because one of the issues we saw with paper pot when we've experimented with it, and we're not done trialing it, but when we've experimented with it a little bit, is that when we put it into compost, and our compost dries pretty quickly, much like I imagine your sand does, do you have moisture issues with it and that? And then how do you sort of work with, the paper pot and the sandy soil? Does it work really well? Is it a good combination? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah, moisture issue sounds good to me. I wish we had some moisture issues, but no, it's. I mean, even if it's a moist bed, it works really, really, really well in sandy, and I think it actually works better. We had Curtis Stone here for an event last year, and he was really surprised on how well it went through the sand. And I should mention too, we use and I just got it from Johnny's. I know there's, I think, a couple different makers of the paper pot itself now, but we just got it from Johnny. So it's the TerraTech brand paper pot, which I don't see a lot of other people using. And based on how easily, and I kind of learned this the first season when we were using the paper pot, and we've been using it, I think this will be the third season that we're using it. It's really heavy. So mixed with our sand, it cuts through really easily and it almost works out better. And I remember Curtis saying that, like, it is a little heavier, but it almost is better for your context. So I'm happy that we did get that TerraTech one. But it is heavy and it does a really nice job with the sand. It's kind of, I'm not sure if the other ones have this, the lighter ones, but it kind of has these putters on the near the wheel, which you can adjust, that kind of kicks dirt further or harder, like kind of trenches it a little bit more. So that works really well depending on what we're transplanting, but also with the sand, I couldn't imagine it with clay, because you're probably getting huge clumps of stuff built, thrown on top of your crops. With the sand, it's really nice because it's just kind of like flipping this super flexible material that kind of will eventually kind of wash off a little bit, but you're able to kind of like hill it a little bit more than you would other ones. And sand does a nice job of like, molding itself around that transplant you're getting in. So, we never want to do it dry on the bed. And I mean, we don't want to, of course, do it soaking wet either, but a nice kind of mixture, having some moisture in there. And of course, having the paper pots heavily watered in makes a big difference with our sand too. So I think the type of paper pot, the level of moisture in the trays, and the level of moisture in the bed help a lot. But no, we love the paper pot. I couldn't imagine farming without it.
That's great. And then in terms of, I'm imagining if it's that easy to get in, it's probably not that hard to get the paper chains and etc. and then the crops out. Like, can you take us through a bed flip in terms of maybe with baby greens or something like that? One with the paper pot and then one that's maybe planted without the paper pot?
Yeah, so we pretty much do it the same way, and I recently just had to train an employee on this, so it's kind of fresh in my mind. But we solely use the wheel weeder. We've tried a lot of different. I feel like this is the age-old question for market gardeners that are specifically growing a lot of salad is the crop out, and you don't really see too much information on it. And I think contextually it works different for different people depending on your microclimates and your soil. But we really like the wheel weeder, and if you can get that blade really sharp, it works really, really nice. So, like I said, it's like a wheel hoe, but it's a little bit more stable. It's heavier, I would imagine. We don't use a wheel hoe here, but it acts as a wheel. It acts as a lot of different things. So, cropping out a bed of baby greens, we grow a ton of arugula. That's our main baby green. Would be trying to crop it out immediately after harvest. So we've gotten a lot better with that. In years past, definitely does not work as well as if you harvest on a Thursday or Friday and let the weekend go, especially in Florida where things grow pretty quick in the heat. And Monday or Tuesday, you're trying to crop it out with a lot of biomass above the soil surface. So we've done a good job at the end of last season and the beginning of this season is getting in there more so in the afternoon too because of the moisture and the heat. So we'll do our harvest, and then later on in the day we'll do mostly our crop out. But it's just really taking that wheel weeder, like I said, the sharper the better, but we're really just trying to get underneath that soil level, leaving the root in there, so it's that fine line. And if it's not too sharp, you'll pull out a lot of the arugula with the root still attached. But the wheel weeder does a really good job of breaking it off. We'll go through that. Like I said, it's 3 passes, so we're overlapping an inch each time. Then we will take rakes, rake it into little piles. We go through, and we've used so we have salads like a old, or it's not old, it was a new a salad spinner, like a washing machine. So we have the what you call shrimp baskets. So we took a old one and we're using that, but it doesn't work as well as this other bin, and I wish I knew where it was, and it just has Chinese, I shouldn't even say Chinese, there's this Asian writing on it. I have no idea where I got it from, but it's super heavy duty, and it's about maybe 20 inches long by maybe a little bit, maybe like 2 feet long by a foot the other way. And it's got these nice little inch by inch holes at the bottom of it. And so we take, for efficiency purposes, we'll not try to go arugula piece by arugula piece and put them into the basket, but we'll try to rake it as best as possible. And we found a rake that does a little bit better than some other ones as far as collecting material, collecting the biomass as opposed to the soil, which is very important because, like I tell employees, we worked really, really hard to get it to this point. We are not trying to take the soil out and put it into the compost pile or give it to the chickens. So we do a really good job of trying to get as little of soil into that basket as possible. And then we are picking up the basket, and this is going to be kind of hard to explain, but we kind of do this shimmy method where it's kind of back and forth, and it's a really good workout. That's how I kind of advertise it to the employees, but use a lot of like core and stuff because you're kind of going back and forth, not really moving your body too much. I hope I'm explaining that correct, but you're kind of just like going back and forth, really just with your abdomen. So that's kind of, you're just trying to stimulate it enough to get the soil to drop out of the bottom, and a decent amount of soil does drop out of the bottom. That makes it worthwhile for us to do that. So we'll go through that. I always tell employees, start at the end of the bed and come towards us, because, or come towards the where we're going to end up, just so we're not carrying it throughout the entire bed. And then after that, we just go ahead and, depending on what it is, either give it to the chickens or in the compost pile. And then we do a lot of Salanova in the paper pots, anything like that. And the paper pots really are easier, I would say way easier than baby greens, just because the wheel weeder does a nice job if you can get it to that right depth of almost popping the paper out of the soil. It won't always happen because it's obviously been in there a while and some decomposition has happened already with the moisture and everything, but at least you'll get some big chunks, and raking it up, you'll kind of get some big chunks of paper chains, and that is a lot easier because then it's not so much soil, it's more potting mix that you may have in the paper pot left over, which doesn't bother me as much. So the paper pot goes by a lot quicker, and that is just wheel weeded, raked up, put in the same process, and that usually always goes to the compost pile. So yeah, not too much of a difference there, but paper pot is way easier than baby greens, I would say.
That is really the shimmy. And I'm assuming that when you're doing the and you're bouncing those baskets, you're just bouncing those over top of the bed, and it's kind of just dropping the soil right on top, and then you're going into your next bed prep.
Right, and that's, I mean, as most people know, the soil surrounding your root structure a lot of times is going to have the most nutrients. It's going to be your healthy. I mean, that's what you want to keep. So yeah, right over the bed, the shimmy, and yeah, off we go. So we try not to spend too much time. In years past, it's crazy, but just to illustrate how hot and almost dry it gets here, but I kind of noticed a little bit of disease pressure with it, so we stopped doing it. But literally, we would crop out a bed of arugula, super thick bed of arugula, and we would just leave it over the weekend to kind of let it do its thing and decompose. And it's so hot and dry that by like Monday or Tuesday, it would pretty much be all gone. But like I said, with the decomposition, and we grow a lot of brassicas and certain things like that, so we would just get some disease pressure, and I think that attributed to it as well. Plus, you have to be a little careful of running irrigation on those beds, because you really do want it to dry out, but it's just not it's kind of it was a little bit of the lazy way to do it, but just to kind of show you how hot and dry it does get, it really doesn't even reattach. But if we do have anything left over from our process now, Monday or Tuesday, we'll come through with the wheel weeder, or if we're going to amend the soil again, we'll go ahead and amend it, add whatever things we need to add, and then we'll wheel weed it, and then that'll get rid of, one or two little pieces of arugula or weeds that we may have missed.
That's super cool. Well, Jordan Cooper, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate all this information.
Yeah, my pleasure, Jesse.
All right, if you enjoyed that episode, make sure to follow Sugartop Farms wherever you do your internet following, Instagram and Facebook. Check out sugartopfarms.com. I'll put all the links in the show notes. Please make sure to check out that event in San Diego in February. I repeat, let's all go learn about no-till and mingle and have a beer in San Diego in February. Can I get an amen? I feel like I can get an amen. I will be there. Josh Satin will likely be there if we can sell enough tickets. It will be awesome. no-tillgrowers.com/events. And like I said, there are discounts for Patreon members at patreon.com/farmerjesse. Otherwise, as long as you are subscribed to the show, we're good. So, happy fall, y'all. Let's get our learn on over the next couple months. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye.
I know it's probably a little different than most people that might be listening to this, just as far as, because you hear all the time people have sandy soil, but we have sand as soil. It's not really sandy, it's sand. So I'm glad I could maybe illustrate that a little bit for people.